The beach was supposed to be our refuge, a place to reconnect. But in one unguarded moment, everything changed. I can't stop replaying that fleeting touch. The way the air between us seemed to shift. Evan, my son, looked at me like he was searching for something. Something I'm afraid I might have given. Now, I'm left questioning everything. The lines we crossed, the words we didn't say, and the weight of the silence that lingers between us. I told myself it was nothing. But what if it wasn't? How do you move forward when a single moment changes everything? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The ocean had always been my refuge. A place where the noise in my head could be drowned out by the crash of the waves and the endless stretch of sky. It was where I went when the weight of life pressed too heavily on my chest. Where I could simply exist without expectations or judgment. I hadn't planned on coming here today. Not until the silence at home grew unbearable. And this time I wasn't alone. Evan sat in the passenger seat next to me, earbuds in, eyes fixed on his phone. The faint reflection of the screen flickered in his glasses, and I wondered, not for the first time, what occupied so much of his attention. He hadn't said much since I'd suggested the trip, only shrugging in that non-committal way of his and nodding when I asked if he'd join me. He was 18 now, legally an adult. It was strange to think about how quickly the years had slipped by. I still pictured him as a boy sometimes, with scraped knees and an untamed curiosity about the world. But the person sitting beside me was someone else entirely. Quiet, self-contained, a mystery I couldn't quite solve. The beach was my attempt at breaking through, at finding some common ground. I told myself it was about giving him space to unwind before he got too swept up in the chaos of adulthood. But deep down I knew it was more selfish than that. I needed to feel close to him again, even if it was just for a few hours. Evan, I said, glancing at him briefly. He didn't look up, so I tapped the volume button on the car stereo, the faint hum of a song fading into silence. What? He asked, pulling one earbud out and turning toward me. I tried to smile, though it felt a little forced. You excited for some fresh air? Get away from that screen for a bit? His mouth quirked into a half-smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sure, that was it. One word. No elaboration. No enthusiasm. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, forcing myself not to push him further. This wasn't about what I wanted, I reminded myself. It was about creating an opportunity, a space where he might feel comfortable opening up. We drove in silence for a while after that, the tires humming along the asphalt as the city gave way to open fields and stretches of wild coastal dunes. The sight of the ocean on the horizon brought a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The beach had always been mine, my sanctuary. Bringing him here felt like I was sharing something sacred, and I didn't know if he'd even notice, let alone care. When I finally pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, I turned to him again. Looks like we've got the place to ourselves, I said, trying to sound upbeat. Evan glanced out the window, his expression unreadable. Yeah. We stepped out into the cool, salty air. The breeze tugged at my shirt as I walked around to the trunk, pulling out a cooler and a couple of towels. Evan stood nearby, his hands shoved into the pockets of his shorts, staring out at the waves. Can you grab the umbrella? I asked, gesturing toward the open trunk. He nodded and reached for it without a word. Watching him, I noticed how much taller he'd gotten. I'd barely registered the changes as they happened, but now, standing beside him, it struck me just how much he wasn't a kid anymore. We made our way down to the sand, the soles of my shoes crunching against the grains as we walked. The beach was almost entirely empty, just a few distant figures near the water's edge and the occasional seagull swooping overhead. I picked a spot far from anyone else and started setting up. Evan helped, though his movements were slow, almost reluctant. He spread out the towels while I wrestled with the umbrella, planting it firmly in the sand. I caught him glancing at his phone a few times, though he never took it out of his pocket. Think you can survive a few hours without that thing? I asked, my tone light, teasing. Evan looked up at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Maybe. Good, I said, brushing my hands off on my shorts. You'll thank me later. He sat down on one of the towels, leaning back on his elbows, his gaze drifting out to the horizon. I settled beside him, the sound of the waves filling the quiet between us. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small step toward connection, or at least I hoped it was. As I watched him sitting there, the sun glinting off his dark hair and the breeze tousling it slightly, I felt a strange ache in my chest. I couldn't name it, didn't want to examine it too closely. For now, I told myself it was enough to just be here with him. The drive stretched on in a haze of quiet roads and rolling landscapes. For the first 20 minutes, the only sound in the car came from the tires humming against the asphalt and the occasional sigh from Evan, who was slouched against the passenger door with one earbud in. His other ear was free, but I wasn't sure if it was because he wanted to stay semi-present or just because it was uncomfortable to keep both in for too long. I kept glancing at him, out of the corner of my eye, as I tried to think of something to say that wouldn't come off as nagging. The truth was, I didn't even mind the silence. It was better than the alternative, forced small talk, or worse, another argument. But still, there was something unsettling about how completely comfortable he seemed in his own little world, as if my presence in the car barely mattered. The suburbs began to fall away, replaced by endless stretches of green and yellow grass, bent and swaying under the summer breeze. Occasionally, a cluster of trees interrupted the horizon, their leaves rustling like waves in the distance. I reached over and fiddled with the radio, trying to break the silence. Static crackled for a moment before I settled on a station playing an old song I used to listen to in college. "Do you remember this one?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Evan didn't look up from his phone. "No, it used to be your mom's favorite," I added, hoping the memory might spark something. "She used to sing it all the time when you were little." "Cool," he said, not unkindly, but without much interest either. I sighed inwardly, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Moments like this always left me feeling like I was trying to reach him through frosted glass, pressing my palm against the surface while he stood on the other side, just out of reach. It wasn't that he was outright rude or dismissive. It was worse than that. He was just indifferent. The ocean finally came into view, a blue line shimmering at the horizon. The sight of it eased something in me, even if only slightly. I glanced at Evan again, hoping for some kind of reaction, but he was still scrolling on his phone, his face lit up by the glow of the screen. "Almost there," I said, more to myself than to him. He nodded absently, the motion so small it was almost imperceptible. The closer we got to the coast, the more the scenery began to shift. The lush grasses gave way to dry, spiky dunes dotted with patches of wildflowers and scraggly bushes. The road narrowed, winding between sandy mounds, and the smell of salt hung heavy in the air. "Here we are," I said, turning into the gravel parking lot of a nearly empty beach. Evan finally looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning the wide expanse of sand and the distant waves crashing against the shore. For a moment, he looked like he might say something, but instead, he just leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car, stretching as the cool breeze washed over me. "Come on," I said, pulling a cooler out of the trunk. "Help me with the umbrella." Evan unfolded himself from the car, stuffing his phone into his pocket and grabbing the umbrella without a word. He followed me toward the beach, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The sand was soft underfoot, warm but not scorching, and the sound of the waves grew louder with every step. A few seagulls circled overhead, their sharp cries cutting through the rhythmic roar of the ocean. "Perfect spot, right?" I said, stopping in a clear area far from the handful of other beachgoers scattered along the shore. Evan nodded, glancing out at the water. I set the cooler down and started unpacking. The towels went first, then the umbrella. Evan stood by, watching me work. "You just gonna supervise? Or are you gonna help?" I teased, raising an eyebrow. He smirked faintly, the first real expression I'd seen from him all day, and knelt down to spread out one of the towels. For a moment, things felt almost normal. Almost. The beach stretched out before us like an untouched canvas, wide and empty except for a few distant figures near the water's edge. It was almost eerily quiet, save for the soft roar of the waves and the occasional caw of a seagull overhead. The late morning sun hung high, casting long shadows across the sand. The sight of it eased something in me, even if only for a moment. "This is what I'm talking about," I said, exhaling deeply as I dropped the cooler onto the sand. "No crowds, no noise, just peace." Evan followed a few steps behind, the umbrella slung over his shoulder. He didn't respond, but his gaze wandered across the beach, taking it all in. I liked to think he was appreciating the solitude too, but with him, it was hard to tell. "Let's set up here," I said, patting the sand with my foot. It was close enough to the water to enjoy the view but far enough to avoid the tide when it crept up later. Evan set the umbrella down and stood there, waiting for instructions. His posture was relaxed, his hands tucked loosely into his pockets, but there was a quiet hesitation about him that I'd grown used to over the years. He didn't argue, didn't complain, he just waited, always a few steps behind. "Here, spread the towels out," I said, kneeling to wrestle with the umbrella. He crouched beside me, pulling the towels from the bag and shaking them out before laying them neatly on the sand. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. I glanced over at him as I dug the umbrella pole into the ground, studying the way his dark hair fell over his forehead, how his face was calm but distant, like he was here but not really present. "Good enough?" I muttered as I finally got the umbrella to stand upright. I sat back on my heels and brushed the sand off my hands. You can actually sit now, you know, relax a little. That's the whole point of this trip. He gave me one of those faint smiles of his, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes, and lowered himself onto one of the towels. He leaned back on his elbows, his legs stretched out in front of him as he stared out at the ocean. For a few minutes we sat in silence. It wasn't the heavy, awkward kind of silence we'd shared on the drive here. It felt lighter, easier. The rhythmic crash of the waves filled the space between us, and for a moment, I let myself believe that this was enough. Then I noticed him reaching into his pocket. "Don't even think about it," I said, my voice half teasing, half serious. He froze, his hand hovering over his phone. "What? You're not going to spend this whole day glued to that thing," I said, nodding toward his pocket. "We came all the way out here. You can survive without it for a few hours." He rolled his eyes but pulled his hand away, letting it fall into the sand beside him. "Fine. See? Was that so hard?" I said, grinning at him. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I guess not." "Good," I said, settling back against the umbrella pole. "You'll thank me later." I let my gaze drift toward the water, the sunlight dancing across the waves in shimmering ribbons of silver and blue. The beach really was perfect today. Quiet, serene, like something out of a postcard. I wanted to say something about it, to point it out to Evan, but when I turned to him I caught him staring at me. He looked away the second our eyes met, his cheeks faintly pink. "You all right?" I asked, frowning slightly. "Yeah," he said quickly, shifting his gaze back toward the ocean. "Just thinking." "About what?" "Nothing," he muttered, his tone dismissive. I didn't press him. Instead, I leaned forward, reaching for the sunscreen in the bag. I held it up and waved it slightly. "You're gonna need this," I said. "I'm fine," he said without looking at me. "Evan, you're pale as hell. If you don't put this on, you're gonna look like a lobster by the time we leave." He sighed and sat up, holding his hand out for the bottle. "Nope," I said, popping the cap open. "Turn around." "What?" "You know you're terrible at this. If I let you do it yourself, you're gonna miss half your back. Just turn around." He hesitated for a second but eventually gave in, shifting around until his back was to me. I squeezed the sunscreen into my palm, the cold, creamy texture spreading between my fingers. I hesitated for a moment before placing my hand on his shoulder, smoothing it over his skin. His back was warm under my touch, his muscles tense at first but gradually relaxing as I worked. It was such a simple, innocuous thing, but something about it felt strange. Not wrong exactly, just different. I let my hand linger for a moment longer than necessary before pulling it back. "All done," I said, capping the bottle and tossing it into the bag. "Thanks," Evan said quietly. He turned back around, his face blank but his movements just a little too stiff. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. I focused on the horizon, trying to ignore the way my chest felt tight, like I just crossed some invisible line I hadn't even known was there. Lunch was quiet, the sound of the waves filling the space between us. I unwrapped the sandwiches I'd packed earlier, handing one to Evan as I leaned back under the shade of the umbrella. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the beach felt warmer now, though the breeze off the water kept it pleasant. Evan took the sandwich with a small nod of thanks, his fingers brushing against mine briefly. He didn't look at me, though. His eyes were fixed on the ocean, distant and unfocused, as if he were somewhere else entirely. "You doing okay?" I asked after a few minutes, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," he said simply, biting into the sandwich. I wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but I stopped myself. The last thing I wanted to do was smother him, especially after how hard it had been to get him to agree to this trip in the first place. Instead, I bit into my own sandwich, chewing slowly as I watched him. Evan had always been quiet, even as a kid, but this kind of silence was different. It wasn't the comfortable stillness of someone lost in their thoughts. It was a wall, thick and impenetrable, that he'd built around himself. And yet, every now and then, I caught these small glimpses of something beneath the surface. The way his jaw tightened when I asked how he was doing. The way he shifted slightly whenever I moved closer. It was like he was holding something back. Something he didn't want me to see. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "I used to come here all the time when I was your age. This beach, it was kind of my escape." Evan glanced at me, just for a second, before looking back at the water. "From what?" "Life," I said with a small shrug. "School. Expectations. Myself mostly." That last part slipped out before I could stop it. I wasn't even sure why I'd said it. It wasn't like Evan needed to hear about my own struggles. But when I looked at him, I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. You never really talk about that stuff, he said quietly, almost like he wasn't sure he should be saying it at all. I set my sandwich down, brushing a few stray crumbs from my lap. Yeah, well, I guess I didn't think it mattered. Not to you anyway. It does, he said, so softly I almost didn't hear him. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I'd expected. I searched his face, trying to read what he wasn't saying. But he turned away, his shoulders hunching slightly as if he were trying to make himself smaller. There was something about the way he said it that made my chest ache. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would let him know I was here, that I cared, but the words felt too big, too fragile. Instead, I picked up my sandwich again and took another bite. After lunch, I suggested we take a walk down the beach. Evan hesitated at first, but eventually he agreed, brushing the sand off his shorts as he stood. We walked side by side, the ocean lapping at our feet, leaving cool trails of foam against the warm sand. Neither of us spoke at first. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't entirely easy either. I could feel the tension simmering between us, unspoken but undeniable, like a storm gathering on the horizon. You've been quiet today, I said finally, glancing at him. Evan shrugged. Just thinking. About what? He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the waves as they rolled in and out. Stuff, I echoed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Care to elaborate? He shook his head. Not really, I sighed, running a hand through my hair. You know, you don't always have to keep everything to yourself. Evan, it's okay to let someone in. I know, he said, but his voice was flat, guarded. I let the conversation drop, not wanting to push him. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he wanted to say, something he was holding back. At one point, he bent down to pick up a small shell, turning it over in his hands. The sunlight caught on its smooth surface, casting a faint shimmer across his fingers. He stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. You gonna start a collection? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. He gave me a small smile, the first real one I'd seen all day. Maybe. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself. When we returned to our spot on the beach, Evan sat down on his towel, leaning forward with his arms resting on his knees. I sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat of the sun on his skin, but not so close that it felt invasive. For a while we just sat there watching the waves. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with questions neither of us seemed brave enough to ask. You really used to come here a lot? He asked after a while, his voice quiet. Yeah, I said. It was my safe place. Still is, I guess. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I get that. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that felt almost tangible. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to press him for more, but something in his posture told me to let it be. For now, I told myself this was enough. The tide had begun to retreat, leaving behind rippling pools of water in the indentations of the sand. I suggested we walk along the shore, mostly because I couldn't sit still any longer. The tension between Evan and me felt like it had grown thicker since lunch, and I needed to move, to shake it off. He agreed without much enthusiasm, pushing himself off the towel and brushing sand off his legs. We walked side by side, close enough that I could hear the soft shuffle of his steps on the wet sand, but far enough apart that the space between us felt deliberate. I glanced at him occasionally, but his gaze stayed fixed on the ground ahead, scanning the tide pools like they might hold answers to questions he wasn't asking out loud. This part's always my favorite, I said, gesturing to the shallow pools glistening in the sunlight. There's something calming about how the water just stays behind, you know? Like it's holding on, even after the tide pulls away. Evan didn't respond at first. His eyes flicked down to the pools, where tiny crabs scuttled sideways over jagged bits of shell and seaweed. Then he said, almost too quietly to hear, "It feels kind of lonely." I frowned, unsure if he was talking about the pools or something else entirely. Lonely? Yeah, he said, bending down to pick up a small broken shell. Like, they're just leftovers. The tide moves on, and this is all that's left behind. He turned the shell over in his fingers, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. His words hit me in a way I hadn't expected, stirring something uncomfortably familiar. I don't think they're leftovers, I said finally. I think they're remnants, pieces of something bigger. They're still part of the ocean, even if they're separate for a while. He didn't answer. Instead, he slipped the shell into his pocket and kept walking. After a while, the sound of the waves faded into the background, replaced by the crunch of our footsteps on damp sand. The sun was high now, casting a golden glow over the water and making the horizon shimmer like a mirage. Evan stopped abruptly, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his shorts. He stared out at the ocean, his jaw tight, and I could tell he was working up to something. "Dad," he said suddenly, his voice low but steady. I turned to face him, my chest tightening at the way he said the word. It wasn't casual, it was deliberate, almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure how I'd respond. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, open. He looked down at his feet, kicking at a patch of sand. "Do you ever feel like you don't fit anywhere?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. "I don't know," he said, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Just like you don't belong, like you're not enough, no matter what you do." His words hung in the air, heavy and raw, and I felt a pang of guilt for all the times I'd assumed his silence meant he didn't care. I took a step closer, closing some of the space between us. "Evan," I said softly, "I think everyone feels like that sometimes. I know I have." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. "Yeah, but it's different for you. You've got everything figured out." I couldn't help but laugh at that, though it wasn't out of amusement. "Trust me, kid. I'm a long way from having everything figured out. Half the time, I'm just winging it and hoping for the best." He frowned, like he didn't quite believe me. "I mean it," I said. "When I was your age, I felt lost all the time. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, who I wanted to be. Hell, some days I still don't." "But you always seem so sure," he said, his voice quieter now. "That's just because I've had more practice pretending," I said with a small smile. "The truth is, nobody really has it all figured out. We're all just doing the best we can with what we've got." He didn't say anything, but I could see the gears turning in his head, the way he chewed on the inside of his cheek like he was trying to process what I'd said. "I know it probably doesn't help much," I added. "But you're not alone, Evan. You don't have to have everything figured out right now. It's okay to feel lost." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the water. For a while, neither of us spoke, and the silence between us felt different, less tense, more honest. As we made our way back toward the umbrella, I noticed how much more relaxed his posture seemed. He wasn't hunched over or staring at the ground anymore. He walked with his head up, his hands swinging loosely at his sides. When we reached our spot, Evan sat down on the towel without a word. I followed, lowering myself onto the sand beside him. "Thanks," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I turned to look at him, surprised. "For what?" "For listening," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't know. I don't really talk about this stuff with anyone." I felt a lump form in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "Anytime, Evan," I said finally. "I mean that." He nodded, and though he didn't say anything else, I could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like we were finally starting to understand each other. We sat side by side on the towel, the ocean stretching endlessly before us. The earlier conversation still lingered between us, though neither of us seemed in a rush to revisit it. The waves rolled in and out, the tide slowly creeping back toward where we sat. The air had grown heavier, warmer, and I could feel the sun's heat on my skin despite the umbrella shading us. Evan shifted beside me, leaning forward so his forearms rested on his knees. His hair hung slightly in his face, damp from the humidity, and his posture was relaxed in a way I wasn't used to seeing. He seemed younger in that moment. Not the reserved, distant teenager I'd struggled to connect with, but something softer, more vulnerable. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, trying to reconcile the boy I'd raised with the man he was becoming. The lines of his face were sharper now, his jaw more defined, but there was still a quietness about him that felt almost childlike. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, but the words caught in my throat. "You ever feel like time just stops?" Evan said suddenly, his voice breaking through the stillness. I turned to him, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "Like, right now," he said, gesturing vaguely at the beach. "It feels like nothing else exists, like we're just here, and that's it." I nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. "Yeah, I felt that way before." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "It's kind of nice." "It is," I agreed, though I couldn't help but notice the undertone in his voice. There was something wistful about it, like he was holding on to the moment as tightly as he could, afraid it might slip away. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavier now, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I was hyper-aware of everything, his proximity, the faint rise and fall of his chest as he breathed, the way his fingers absent-mindedly traced patterns in the sand. "Dad?" he said softly, breaking the silence again. "Yeah." He didn't look at me, Do you think people ever really know each other? Like, completely? The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer but found that I didn't have a ready response. Instead, I leaned back on my hands, letting out a slow breath as I thought. I think it depends, I said finally. Some people don't want to be known. They keep parts of themselves locked away, even from the people they care about. Evan turned to me then, his expression unreadable. Why do you think they do that? Maybe they're scared, I said. Or maybe they think no one will understand. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the sand between us. Yeah, he murmured, almost to himself. The vulnerability in his voice hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to reach out to him, to put a hand on his shoulder or say something that would make him feel less alone. But I hesitated. The moment felt too fragile, like one wrong move could shatter it. Instead, I shifted slightly closer, enough that our shoulders were almost touching. The warmth of him was startling, and I caught myself holding my breath. Evan, I said softly, you know you don't have to keep things to yourself, right? Whatever you're feeling, you can talk to me. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt the air shift between us. There was something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded that made my chest tighten. I know, he said quietly. And then, without thinking, I reached out and placed a hand on his back, the gesture meant to be reassuring. His skin was warm under my palm, and I felt the subtle tension in his shoulders as he stiffened, just for a moment. I didn't pull my hand away. Are you okay? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Evan nodded, though the motion was hesitant. Yeah, he trailed off, his eyes dropping to the sand again. What is it? I pressed gently. I don't know, he said finally. I just feel weird. Weird how? He shrugged, his shoulders shifting under my hand. I don't know. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Or how I'm supposed to feel. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I didn't know how to handle. You don't have to figure it all out right now, I said softly. It's okay to just feel whatever you're feeling, even if it doesn't make sense. Evan turned to me again, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't quite define. For a moment it felt like time really did stop, like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us sitting there on the sand. And then, slowly, he leaned into my touch, just enough that I could feel the shift in his weight. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know what to do, didn't know what this moment meant or where it was leading, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Dad, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. Yeah, I managed to say, my voice shaky. He hesitated, his lips parting slightly as if he were about to say something else. But instead he just shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Nothing, he said. Never mind. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my hand dropping from his back. The moment passed, slipping away as quickly as it had come, but the weight of it lingered. We sat there in silence for a while longer, neither of us saying a word. The sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows stretching across the sand, and I knew we'd have to pack up soon. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the way the air had shifted between us. Something had changed, and I didn't know what to do about it. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting the beach in shades of amber and gold. It was beautiful, but I barely noticed it. My thoughts felt heavy, tangled, like I was caught in a web I couldn't quite pull myself out of. Evan had been quiet ever since we left the tide pools and returned to our spot on the beach. Not that silence was unusual for him, but this wasn't the same easy, detached kind of quiet I was used to. This felt different. Like there were words hovering on the edge of his tongue that he couldn't quite bring himself to say. I wanted to ask him if he was okay, to revisit whatever had happened back there. But every time I opened my mouth, I stopped myself. I didn't trust my voice, didn't trust myself to say the right thing. Instead, I busied myself with packing up. The cooler, the towels, the umbrella. All of it went back into the car with practiced efficiency. Evan helped without a word, his movements stiff and mechanical. Almost done, I said, trying to fill the silence with something, anything. He nodded, handing me the last of the towels before brushing sand off his shorts. When everything was packed, I glanced at him, studying his face. His expression was calm, unreadable, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there earlier. Ready to head out? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. Yeah, he said quietly, avoiding my gaze. The drive home was uncomfortable. Neither of us spoke. The only sound in the car was the low hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of wind as it passed through the barely cracked windows. Evan had his phone out again, but I could tell he wasn't really paying attention to it. His thumb hovered over the screen, scrolling aimlessly, his eyes distant and unfocused. I couldn't stop replaying the moment on the beach in my mind, turning it over and over like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. The way he'd leaned into my touch. The way he'd said my name, so soft, so hesitant. The way my chest had tightened like a knot being pulled too tight. I clenched the steering wheel a little harder, trying to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't go. They clung to me like the salt on my skin, impossible to scrub off. "You okay?" I asked finally, the words breaking the thick silence. Evan looked up from his phone, startled, like he hadn't realized I'd been watching him. "Yeah," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "I'm fine." I nodded, though his answer didn't reassure me. "You sure?" I pressed, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He hesitated, his thumb brushing over the edge of his phone. "Yeah," he said again, softer this time. I let it drop, my chest tightening with the weight of everything unsaid. When we pulled into the driveway, the sky had darkened into a deep shade of blue, the stars just beginning to peek through. Evan got out of the car first, grabbing his bag from the back seat without waiting for me. "I'm gonna head up," he said, his voice flat. "Thanks for today." He didn't look at me as he spoke, and before I could respond, he was already heading toward the house. I sat there in the car for a moment, the engine still running, staring at the empty passenger seat. The silence felt deafening. When I finally went inside, the house was dark except for the faint glow of a light from upstairs. Evan's room. I could hear the muffled sound of his footsteps as he moved around, and then, after a while, nothing. I dropped the cooler in the kitchen and went to the sink, splashing cold water on my face. My reflection in the window above the sink looked tired, worn. There was a hollowness in my chest I couldn't shake, a gnawing uncertainty that made it hard to breathe. What had I done? The question had been circling in my mind since it happened, relentless and unforgiving. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know if there was one. All I knew was that something had shifted between us. Something I didn't understand, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Later that night, as I sat alone in the living room with a glass of whiskey in my hand, I heard Evan's footsteps on the stairs. They were light, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should come down or not. He stopped just outside the doorway, his shadow stretching into the room. "Dad!" I looked up, startled by the sound of his voice. He was standing there, his arms crossed over his chest, his face half hidden in the shadows. "Yeah," I said, setting the glass down on the coffee table. He hesitated, his gaze flicking away from mine. "Never mind," he said finally, turning back toward the stairs. "Evan." But he was already gone, his footsteps retreating up the stairs. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand over my face. The weight in my chest felt unbearable, like I was carrying something too big for me to hold. The house was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this silence was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something else. Something I couldn't name, something I didn't know how to face. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It was well past midnight, but sleep wasn't coming. I sat alone at the edge of my bed, staring at the dark window across the room, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. The moonlight illuminated just enough of the room to make the shadows feel larger than they were. I couldn't stop replaying the day in my head, as if turning over the pieces would somehow make them fit together. But no matter how I looked at it, I kept coming back to the same feelings, the tension, the confusion, the weight of that moment on the beach. I rubbed my temples, letting out a heavy sigh. My chest felt tight, as if something heavy had been pressing on it all day, and the silence of the house wasn't helping. Evan's door was just down the hall, and for a fleeting moment, I thought about knocking, about asking him what was on his mind. Maybe if I could get him to talk, I could make sense of it all. But the thought evaporated as quickly as it came. I didn't know what I'd even say. What could I say? I stood and walked to the window, resting my hand on the frame. Outside, the backyard was still, bathed in pale moonlight. The trees cast long shadows over the grass, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost cruel, given the storm brewing inside my chest. A faint creak from the hallway broke the stillness. I turned, my breath catching for a moment as I listened. Footsteps, soft, hesitant. They stopped just outside my door, and then there was a quiet knock. "Dad." His voice was barely audible, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. "Yeah," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Evan stepped inside. He was in a t-shirt and shorts, his hair tousled like he'd been lying awake just as long as I had. He looked younger somehow, like the weight he carried during the day had melted away, leaving only the vulnerability underneath. "Hey," he said quietly, lingering near the doorway. "Hey," I replied, unsure what else to say. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us stretching. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and I could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air like a third presence in the room. "What's on your mind?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his chest. I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "Me neither." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "About earlier on the beach." My chest tightened. "Evan, you don't have to." "No, I do," he said quickly, cutting me off. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Confusion, fear, maybe even hope. I don't know what to think, or what to feel. I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced, trying to find the right words, but everything felt wrong. "Evan," I said softly, "it's okay to feel confused. Whatever it is you're feeling, it's okay." He nodded, though he still looked unsure. I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not weird," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. "We're okay, Evan. I promise." His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he gave me a faint, hesitant smile. "Okay." He lingered for a moment longer before stepping back toward the door. "Good night, Dad," he said quietly. "Good night," I replied, watching as he disappeared into the hallway. When the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I sank back down onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. We were okay. At least that's what I told him. But as I sat there, staring at the empty space where he'd stood, I couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. Whatever had shifted between us on the beach had left its mark, an invisible line that neither of us could fully cross back over. And as much as I wanted to reassure him, to reassure myself, I knew that some things couldn't be undone. The house was silent again, but the weight of the day lingered like a shadow, following me even as I lay back on the bed and closed my eyes.